Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Sputnik International reports Vladimir Zelensky signed a decree outlawing peace negotiations with Moscow in 2022, months after the West sabotaged a ready peace treaty to pursue an all-out proxy war against Russia. President Putin has expressed readiness to find negotiators to speak directly with Zelensky. Putin has said, quote, "If he wants to take part in negotiations, I will select such people. It's not an issue. The question is about the final signing of documents." Putin said he was noting that Zelensky's legitimacy has expired and he therefore does not have the right to sign anything. Is this another roadblock to peace, as Lil Marco says that both Russia and Ukraine will have to make so-called concessions in order to reach the peace deal promised by Donald Trump? Let's connect some dots and find out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Good afternoon again, and welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. Here's the point. We have a tendency to view current events as though they take place in a vacuum, failing to understand the broader historical context in which most of these events occur. During each episode, my guests and I have probing, provocative, and in-depth discussions that connect the dots between these events and the broader historic context in which they take place, thus enabling you to better understand and analyze the events that are impacting the global village in which we live. Today's episode, the issue is: what are we to do with Ukraine? Donald Trump promised that he was going to get this thing settled within 24 hours of his inauguration, and that has failed to happen. And do they continue to get in their own way? And so for insight, let's turn to my guest. He's a former Marine intelligence officer who served in the former Soviet Union implementing arms control agreements and on the staff of General Norman Schwarzkopf during the Gulf War, where he played a critical role in the hunt for Iraqi Scud missiles. From 91 to 98, he served as a chief weapons inspector for the United Nations in Iraq, leading the search for WMDs. And his latest book, covering Ukraine, the Scott Ritter interviews through the eyes of Anya K, or is it Anya? That might be Anya K. Scott Ritter, as always, my brother, welcome back.
Thanks very much for having me.
It's Anya K, isn't it?
I think it's Anya, yeah.
Yeah, okay, all right. Before we get to this discussion about where we are right now in Ukraine, a couple weeks ago, you put together a program of which I was a participant, No Nuclear War. And you and I were talking before we came on the air, I wanted you to let folks know what kind of response you received from that program.
Well, I mean, first of all, I want to thank you again and all the others who participated in this event. We put it on at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. And it was three panels, attacking three different angles of the problem we face regarding nuclear war, the danger of nuclear war, and then how pressure could be put on the Biden administration not to provoke a nuclear war prior to them leaving office, and then what could be done to put pressure on the Trump administration to either commit to rescinding the policies of the Biden administration which at that time were provoking a nuclear conflict, and or committing once Trump became president that they wouldn't go forward with these deliberately provocative policies. Prior to that, I spent some time walking the halls of Congress, knocking on doors, meeting with members of Congress and their respective staffs. I think people sometimes take a look at these exercises and maybe they think they're exercises in narcissism, where I just want to feel good and important, and so I go around and I knock on doors and I talk to people, and then I book the National Press Club, and I bring in, big names like yourself, and we have these highfalutin talks that make us feel important because we're on a panel that we ourselves created. And then at the end of the day, we pat ourselves on the back, but the people watching are going, oh, what good did that do? How, did this really change anything? Wilmer, I think you know me, but I'll just reintroduce myself to your eyes. I don't play those games. I don't really give a damn what people think about me. I'm not a narcissist. I look in the mirror and I see what I see. What I am is somebody who is mission focused. And I made a decision back in September that I was going to focus my efforts on trying to stop the threat of a nuclear war. I felt very concerned that the Biden administration was moving us in a direction that could lead to a nuclear war. My concerns have since been reinforced by statements made by the Russian government and U.S. intelligence officers who say we were very, very close to a nuclear war because of the very things I was warning about: irresponsible policies allowing Ukraine to use U.S. missiles to attack Russia in a manner that Russia deemed represent an existential threat to its national security and survival. And so this panel that we had in December was sort of an act of desperation because we were running out of time. The Biden administration was doubling down on stupid, green lighting these ATACMS missile attacks against Russia. And the Trump administration was being strangely silent on the issue, which was just causing problems for the Russians who were thinking, well, can we afford to wait for Trump? Bottom line is, Wilmer, we achieved great results. I can tell you that the members of Congress, their staffers that we talked to, were deeply impressed not only with the discussions that we had, many of them making commitments to put pressure on the Trump at that time transition team, but on the panel itself. The panel was the staffers attended it. The panel was streamed. People watched it, and this was discussed by others. The things that we discussed about on the panel were discussed in the inner circles of power making in Washington, D.C., where it had an impact on the policy. Trump did commit to reversing the ATACMS, greenlighting of ATACMS missiles against Ukraine. And today, the Trump administration is on a path of breaking totally free of the policies of the Biden administration, which is a topic we'll be talking about. But anybody who thinks that these things are narcissistic exercises in futility, think again. When you get the right people to focus on the right issue and they do it in a way that has been mapped out to achieve maximum results. There was a lot of strategizing going on into who we were going to talk to, what we were going to speak about, what we were going to say on this panel. And the strategizing paid off. We had an impact, which should tell everybody one thing: democracy works. We, the people of the United States of America, when our voices can be focused on issues in a proper manner, backed up by fact-based analysis, we can have an impact on the major issues of the day. And what we accomplished through that panel regarding preventing a nuclear war is proof positive of just that.
Two things. One, I want to be very clear. When you talk about strategizing, we were not told what to say. No. all you did was ask me if I would participate. You told me what the issues were, and that was the end of the conversation. I want to be very clear that people don't think.
Right, but people have to understand that that's a strategy in and of itself.
Oh, absolutely. You got to
the right people and then let them talk.
Exactly.
That produces the best results.
I just based on your explanation, I just wanted to be sure people didn't think, oh, and they were given a script and told them.
No.
That did not happen. And the other thing that I took out of this, or I took away from this, having participated in it, you and I do a lot of shows together. You and I are trying to play golf together.
We're going to do it.
But our politics in many regards are very, very different.
Yes.
But that doesn't stop us from A, being friends, and B, working in concert on the issues where we do agree. And it also doesn't prevent us from having conversations about things we disagree on. So
I remember the I'm not going to air it here, but I remember exactly one of the issues that we were talking about. It was a conversation I had with a certain individual, and I was saying my impressions, and you were like, "That's not the impression I have of that individual." And in this day and age where my God, you're not allowed to disagree. What people would expect, that I was going to be offended that Wilmer Leon disagreed with something I said. I wasn't offended at all. I'm like, I understand where you're coming from. Man, tell me more about it. I want to know more about it. I want to get, and you were more than happy to hear me out on what I had to say. And we both went, okay, we got that. Now let's move on to the next issue. We don't let these things get in the way. In fact, I'm always stronger because of these kinds of conversations. If everybody just nodded their head at every stupid thing that came out of my mouth, nothing but stupid things would come out of my mouth. But every once in a while, when I said, I'm not saying what I said was stupid. What I'm saying is when I put stuff out there, when people push back, that forces me to go, why are they pushing back? Especially people I respect. Why are people I respect pushing back? There has to be a reason. So let me figure out that. And that doesn't mean that I'm wrong, but it means that there's nuance. That means that there's depth. That means that there's complexity to this problem that I'm better off understanding, so that the next time I address it, I don't come off as, being simplistic or, overly partisan or something, that I throw some nuance in. And oftentimes I find myself corrected where I say, that changes my attitude altogether. That changes my approach. I'm going to pull back and re-examine this problem. So one, I thank you for the pushback. And two, I hope we continue to push back against each other this way, because it just, from my perspective, makes me a stronger analyst, and I hope you feel the same way.
And two things, and then we'll move on. One, I've always told my son, don't ever allow someone else's relationship with a person impact your relationship with that person, because they're totally different things, and you have to make your assessment as they've made their assessment based upon the realities that you're confronting. So I make that point just to say, we were talking about it. You had a perspective on a person. I had a perspective on that person. We talked it out. And the other thing is to demonstrate this. I want to say it was 20 years ago it was the Iraq War when I first heard your name. And it was a few years after that I first had you on my show. Who would have thought then that Scott Ritter would be in Florida supporting Chairman Omali Yeshitela? That to me is a clear demonstration of how, if you're blinded by a stereotype or just presumptions based upon someone's political leanings, you can make very grave mistakes, and you can lose incredibly powerful allies. So with that, Senju asks, I don't know if you read comments, but please ask Mr. Ritter this. Yesterday, Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia met with the new al-Qaeda leader of Syria. Do you think Russia had planned the collapse of Syria with Turkey?
No, I don't think Russia planned that at all. What nation plans a strategic defeat, and goes along with it? Look, Russia and Iran both suffered strategic setbacks in Syria. The reasons for this are still being studied, both in Moscow and in Tehran. But I think the fact of the matter is, the collapse of the Assad regime took everybody by surprise, the rapidity of the collapse. And, nations have to adjust accordingly. You can sit there and do nothing but lick your wounds, and then nothing happens. The Russians, are adept. They're like prize fighters. They took a shot. They've bounced back. They're maneuvering. And of course, diplomatically, they're going to be engaged. The Russians aren't like the United States, where we refuse to talk to people who are opposed to us. The Russians are engaging with HTS in Syria, not because they applaud them or support them, but because that's the new reality that Russia has to deal with. And I think sometimes when Americans see that, we read too much into that. But no, Russia didn't plot against Syria. Russia engaged in 2015 strategically to prop up the regime of Bashar al-Assad. And Russia was there for 7 years doing more than that, 9 years doing just that. And, to sit there and say that Russia's going to throw away a 9-year strategic investment, for what reason? And the same thing with Iran. When the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Command comes out and say, we suffered a strategic defeat in Syria, that implies that there wasn't any, back channel deal with the Turks and all this stuff, that basically both Russia and Iran were overcome by events. Events happened in a manner that unfolded in a manner that were not only not predicted, but to which there wasn't an adequate response. They tried to come up with a diplomatic response, I believe, in meetings in Oman, where the Iranians and the Russians told the Syrians, you got to start talking to Turkey now. But it was too late. The Turks went, it's too late. The war's over. We won. And it was over. It was that quick. That doesn't mean that the Russians and the Iranians were plotting against Syria. It means that they were desperately trying to come up with a diplomatic solution, but events unfolded too fast. The Damascus had fallen before the Russians could get the Syrians to agree to talk to the Turks.
And Cherie asked, what did the United States do? And if I understand her question, they funded al-Jilani. He was basically the United States operative. He and his militia, for lack of a better word, were the United States proxies in the move. If Cherie, if that's what you were asking, that I think is the answer to the question. So we opened the show talking about comments by President Putin saying that if Zelensky wants to talk, that Putin will find the people to talk to him, but that Zelensky's legitimacy as president has expired. And from my understanding of the Ukrainian constitution, that is true, that after his term is over, that the power of the presidency goes to the Rada, their legislature, even if martial law is put in place. Scott Ritter.
Again, the fine elements of Ukrainian constitutional law may escape me, but I think you are fundamentally right, and I think that's basically the assessment of the Russians. The Russians are very legalistic. You can't enter a deal unless everything, all the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted, even though they don't cross their T's.
Putin is an attorney.
He is an attorney, but he's also the president, surrounded by other attorneys.
No, I'm just saying. When you say that Russia is legalistic, you're right, and he is an attorney, which means there's a mindset, there's a thought process. For example, I went to law school, and one of the courses that I took was legal writing, and that is something now in my writing style that I just can't get away from. So just the fact that he's an attorney means there is a thought process that he engages in. That's why I made that point.
Yeah, no, I mean, to show you, I've written a number of books, and they've been published in foreign languages around the world. And every book, the publisher, has copyright, 20 whatever the year of the published the book, and Scott Ritter, and it's just assumed that that's it, and it is. It's legally correct. The Russians went, we need. And there's a process where you actually get a certificate. They don't accept that the publisher has filed and this and that. They need the actual document that proves it. And we had to go through a process to register. It costs like $100 and some odd bucks to get this certificate to be produced that we could then show to the Russians, and they could check off on the box that says copyright verification completed. The Russians don't do anything unless all of the boxes are ticked off. And when it comes to closure with a deal with Ukraine on bringing this to work, the agreement has to be signed by the proper legal authority, and Zelensky does not check off that box. But there's also politics behind this. The Russians are sending a signal that Zelensky will not be part of the post-Ukraine reality. that, yeah, he's there now, and if he wants to sit at the table, he can sit at the table. They'll put people in there, but he's not going to be part of the post-conflict reality of Ukraine. He will be gone. He has no legitimacy. If he was to be reinserted, there would have to be elections. But I think we're going to find that the terms that the Russians are going to insist on is that these elections aren't going to include anybody who has political entanglements with the present Ukrainian government. It has to be a completely new team. And that's the thing. A lot of people look at this and say, oh, man, Putin's getting ready to send a negotiating team to the Ukrainians. That means the Russians are folding. No, the Russians aren't folding. The Russians have said all along, we have objectives. Those objectives will be met. And whatever agreement we have, we'll make sure that these objectives are met. We have specific conditions. Those will be incorporated in the agreement. And, what they've said is whatever agreement is finalized will be agreement based upon the present reality. And here's where we come in. You alluded to Marco Rubio. What makes Marco Rubio, what makes Donald Trump think they have a vote here? I mean, it's amazing how, I've seen these, we've seen scams like this in real life where, there's two companies negotiating a deal, and somebody slides in the end, goes, hey, I'll be the middleman. I'll get a 30% cut from each of you. Boom, boom, boom. I'll make this deal happen. And the two sides are going, who are you? And that's sort of what Trump's doing here. He's just sliding in saying, yeah, I'm here to solve the problem. I'm here to make a deal. And the Russians are like, but you aren't part of this process. You don't have a vote. You're actually on the other team. You don't get to come in here and make a deal. We make the deal because to the victors go the spoils. And the last time we checked on the battlefield, Donald Trump and Marco Rubio, Russia's winning. And so it's interesting to see how the egos of the United States are going to play out here as this thing winds down. But what is clear is that Russia's in charge. Russia will dictate the outcome. Russia dictates the terms. And one of the terms that Russia is making clear is that Zelensky will not be the person who puts pen to paper to finalize any potential peace deal.
What did you, and you alluded to this, but I'd like a little more elaboration on your thoughts when Lil Marco came out and talking about the pausing of foreign aid. Then Zelensky comes out and says, well, we've still gotten all the money we've been promised. It seems as though Rubio, well, and also let me add one more thing to that, because Rubio made the point about, ending the war as Donald Trump promised, reaching a peace deal promised by Donald Trump, as though he's really in control and able to pull that off.
Yeah, there's a couple of things. Marco Rubio is in charge of the State Department. That's it. He's not in charge of the Department of Defense. And the Ramstein support group that had, the meeting that's been going on to coordinate support with Ukraine over time was run by the Department of Defense. And most of the contracts that deal with weapons and ammunition and stuff are programs run by the Department of Defense, where the State Department has little or no say in them in the way this was constructed. And so it's possible that Marco Rubio can follow presidential order saying that all foreign aid is stopped, but that foreign aid is foreign aid controlled by the State Department. That means that USAID, the United States Agency for International Development, those funds are stopped. The State Department's other programs of funding various things inside Ukraine are stopped. And any Department of Defense activity that required State Department signing off on is stopped. But and I've said this before, there's probably hundreds of millions of dollars worth of equipment in the pipeline where all the paperwork has been done. And it's just a matter now of facilitating the transfer. And that stuff's not going to that stuff's not going to be halted. At the same time that we're talking about the halting of foreign aid, the United States has brokered a deal with Israel where they're shipping 90 Patriot missiles. These are American Patriot missiles stored in Israel that we were making available to the Israelis. They've been transferred now to, I believe, Poland for onward transfer to to Ukraine. That's 90. These missiles cost a couple $1 million each. So we're talking about $300 million worth of weaponry right there. That's going through. So that hasn't been stopped. There's Israeli Patriot systems, older model Patriot systems now that are being pulled out of mothballs because Israel no longer feels threatened by Iranian missile attack. And they're being sent to the United States, where Raytheon is going to update them, modernize them, buff them up, and then ship them on to Ukraine. This doesn't happen in a vacuum. There's money involved in the shipment and the refurbishment and the shipment, et cetera. And here we're talking again, probably more than a couple $1 billion worth of material. That's not stopping. So Zelensky's right. There is a certain amount of military aid that continues to make its way to Ukraine.
Was Rubio just trying to send a political signal with saying that? Was he new to the game and so didn't really know? And also, because you talk about the responsibilities between the Department of State and the Department of Defense, but those responsibilities to a certain degree seem to have been blurred with the former Secretary of State under Joe Biden.
Yeah, I mean there is an issue here about Tony Blinken and what role it's a tongue twister. What role Blinken played, starting in September. We know that on September 13th, Joe Biden appeared to be in control of some of the major decision-making moments. We know that there was a big fight between the Department of State and the Department of Defense about the green lighting of ATACMS missiles, the use of ATACMS missiles by Ukraine against Russian targets. The Department of Defense was straight up against it. Lloyd Austin went to the Ramstein contact group, met with Zelensky and said, no, you're not going to get that. This is after Blinken promised the Ukrainians that we were going to greenlight it, we being the United States. And then Blinken went to Kiev and met with his counterparts, met with the British, and they were flying into Washington, D.C. on the 13th for a meeting where this would have been greenlit. This could have caused a nuclear war. This is how close we came to dying. This prompted Anatoly Antonov, the Russian ambassador, to make a statement to people who called in saying, if you do this, there will be a nuclear war, and it will not be limited to Europe. We will strike Washington, D.C. And they went, what? And they got that into the White House, and it was embarrassing for Biden because he had to, Kurt Starmer was there with documents for him to sign, and he had to back away from it. It was a very embarrassing moment, but he was in charge. He made the call. Something happened, especially after the November election, where Blinken suddenly is bypassing the Department of Defense and greenlighting Ukrainian actions that were, at least the Department of Defense had a veto. When they were finally given the green light to use the ATACMS missiles, the Defense Department was saying, we don't know anything about this. And Lloyd Austin's like, I wasn't briefed on this, and no one ever came to me and asked this. And Biden was silent. The White House was silent. This was the State Department going rogue, I believe. And so it did muddy the waters in terms of command relationships and such. And maybe what Marco Rubio is doing now is trying to be assertive in terms of that he's in control of what he's in control. I don't think Rubio has been fully briefed on the complexity of how the U.S. interfaces with Ukraine, the various contract relationships, et cetera. And as a result, he ends up saying, posturing in ways that make him look foolish, as if he's in charge. I'm in charge. And I don't think the new Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, I think. I don't think he's fully. We're early in this administration with two people who are just confirmed taking the reins, and I don't think they're well briefed. But the president wants them to be leaning forward aggressively. So, what do you do when you don't fully know what's going on? You bluff, you posture, you puff out your chest, and you say, "Yeah, I got this. I'm in charge. Yeah, what are you going to do about it?" But inside your head, you're going, "I have no idea what's going on." And that's what's going on with Rubio, and that's going on with Hegseth. I think they need to get their national security team together. They have to start convening these National Security Council meetings at the deputy level, at the principal level, and they have to start coordinating and finding out just what the hell's going on because they inherited a big mess, and they're going to have to be able to define what this mess is if they're going to try and untangle it to get the United States out of this out of this conflict.
In fact, and that takes me right to my next question, because to me, their big problem, which I don't see how they square the circle, is the one thing the United States will never admit to is that it lost. And this thing is a huge L. Check the box in the L column. So part of what I see them trying to figure out is how they create this narrative, how they spin this tale that this is not a flat out defeat, if I may say, ass whooping for the United States.
Yeah, what's curious here is that President Trump is trying to, I mean, you've seen his narrative. This war would never have happened had I been president. Mm-hmm. Meaning that, you know, he claims that the 2020 election was stolen. If it had been stolen, he would have been president. This war would never have happened. And therefore, he's setting up, you know, the narrative that says this is Joe Biden's war. This isn't America being defeated. This is Joe Biden being defeated. He got us in a war we should never been in. I would never have done this. Biden did it. So we're saving by pulling out. He played the same, you know, was trying to play the same stunt in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. But here's the reality. This is Donald Trump's war. People need to understand that. Donald Trump became the president in 2017. Right about that time, the United States started building these massive training facilities in Western Ukraine that were geared to train 1 battalion of Ukrainian forces every 55 days for the sole purpose of going to east to fight the Russians in the Donbass. That was our purpose as the United States. We were leading that effort. We were training the Ukrainians to fight the Russians to liberate the Donbass. We were giving the Ukrainians hundreds of millions of dollars of weaponry, Stinger missiles, Javelin missiles, trucks, you know, the whole works. This was Donald Trump's presidency that was doing this. He's the one, you know, I don't know why people, the CIA has established 20 bases in Ukraine. When did they do that? Under Donald Trump. So the CIA had this, the strategy of strategically defeating Russia, which the Biden administration has articulated publicly, was the policy of the United States under Donald Trump. This is Donald Trump's war. This is, you know, this is the reality. He's trying to slough it off on bad execution on the part of Joe Biden. But the reality is, had Donald Trump been the president of the United States, remember, the crises of Russian troop movement took place in 2021, right after Trump left. January 20th, 2021 is when Biden came in, and he had to have an emergency meeting in June 2021 because of the troop movement during this time. That troop movement was happening because of the policies of Donald Trump, not because of the policies of Joe Biden. Donald Trump is the one who didn't put pressure on the British or on the French and the Germans to bring closure to the Minsk agreement. Donald Trump's the one that perpetuated the fraud of Minsk so that NATO could build the army that Donald Trump was funding so that it could do. So I think Trump is just betting on the fact that most Americans don't know this.
Don't know the truth. Don't know the facts.
Aren't focused on it. Yeah.
And so you're talking about these bases and training of a battalion every 55 days. That also takes us to a story about Ukrainian conscription, and there's this big battle they're looming about this conscription of men between the ages of 18 and 25, and that Ukraine is being asked to cast a wider conscription net so that they can send more bodies to the meat grinder.
I mean, that's one of the sickening realities of this situation, where we have, on the one hand, the Trump administration claiming that they want to bring an end to this conflict. I mean, the ridiculous post of Donald Trump on his Truth Social in all caps, "This war must end," as if, but putting in all caps, Vladimir Putin going, "Oh God, Donald Trump's serious. He put it all in caps. This war must end." but at the same time, putting pressure on Ukraine to lower the conscription age because they've got to get more meat into the meat grinder. I don't think, Keith Kellogg, who is the principal advisor on this issue to Donald Trump, understands. Which, in fact, is we know he doesn't understand it because he is a prisoner to Ukrainian data regarding casualties, which dramatically underplays the number of casualties that the Ukrainian military has suffered, and mirror imaging the reality of Ukrainian casualties onto the Russians, who in fact have suffered much fewer. He's repeating this, and Donald Trump's repeating as if these numbers, matter, as if these numbers have a relevance. They don't. The truth of the matter is, and I think the BBC came out with, they're starting to pick up on this, that the Russians have suffered around 95 to 98,000 dead in the Ministry of Defense.
Okay.
If you add in other numbers, I think you can bring that number up to around 140, 150. That's a lot. It took us 10 years to lose 58,000 in Vietnam. Here in 3 years, we're talking about, 140, 150,000 dead Russians. That's a lot of dead Russians. The Ukrainians have lost over 1 million men dead. Okay, that's the reality. And the Russian numbers are heavily weighted by the large number of casualties they took up front in the war. Here, you have the media talking about human wave assaults of Russians. The Russians aren't launching human wave assaults. It just isn't happening. That's not the way the Russians fight. The Russians are very deliberate in their attacks. A lot of preparation. That doesn't mean that every attack succeeds. Yes, you will get the videos of the Russian tanks hitting a mine. You will get a video of a Russian armored personnel carrier getting hit by a missile and the troops rolling out on fire and getting killed. It's war, high-intensity conflict, and these things happen. But the Russians are prevailing every day. It's more villages captured, more outflanking, cutting the highway here, seizing the high ground here, taking the high-rise apartments there. Not in isolated, but along the entire front. Russia is doing this, and they do this because they are dominating the battlefield. I speak to Russian journalists who are right there on the front line. I say, what about the casualties? He goes, yeah, there's days where we suffer a lot of wounded, but no dead, because we're in control of them, but we're slaughtering them. He said there are days where they have 21 casualty ratio, meaning that for every Russian casualty, there's 20 Ukrainian casualties. And this is what the Ukrainians dug in on the defensive, where normally the attacker-defender ratio should be 3-1, meaning for every defender down, the attackers lose 3. The Russians have flipped the script, and for every one Russian that goes down, there's 20 going down. That's the reality of the meat grinder that's going on. And now Trump says you got to get your 18-year-olds out of the ground, from mama's skirt, and you're going to put them in with no training whatsoever and feed them into this meat grinder where they're just going to die, and you're going to see those casualty ratios go up to around 30, 40, 50 to 1. It'll be a one side. And once the Russians break through the final built up areas in Donetsk and they get into Dnipropetrovsk, look at the map, flat terrain, no tree lines, and it will be a slaughter of the Ukrainian forces. And this is what Trump wants the Ukrainians to do. This war needs to end. On this, I agree with Donald Trump. And if anybody's out there and fly the little Ukrainian flag on their social media page, doing their little moralizing, I'm with Ukraine. If you're with Ukraine, this war must end, because I'm telling you right now, the Ukrainians are going to lose a hell of a lot of people winding this thing down, because we're getting into the stage of this conflict where collapse is occurring. We've talked about this before, Wilmer, how you have correlation of forces, and they're grinding, but eventually the Russians keep building up and the Ukrainians keep building down, and at some point in time, the equilibrium on the battlefield folds. Wham! And the Russians go forward. And at that moment, it will be an absolute slaughter for the Ukrainians. So if you care about the Ukrainians, you want this war to end before that equilibrium is burst, because we are getting close to the point where it is going to burst. And when it happens, it will be bloody, horrible for the Ukrainians. And for the Russians, I always point out to people, the bloodiest month during World War II in the European theater for American troops wasn't June 1944, D-Day. That was a big battle. It wasn't December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge. It was April 1945, when the war was over. The bloodiest month was when the war was over, when the Germans were defeated, because people with their backs against the walls fight the hardest. And so the final month of this conflict, if we get to that equilibrium, will be bloody for the Russians as well, because they're going to be pushing up against an enemy who's desperate, who has to make a final stand. Every battle becomes the Alamo for them. There is no tomorrow. It is the moment now. That's the way this war is going to do, and it's going to be bloody for both sides. If you want the bloodshed to stop, this war has to come to an end now, which means, though, it has to come to an end on terms that Russia will accept. Russia is the victor. To the victor go the spoils.
Well, and to that point, little Marco keeps using language such as there's no way Russia takes all of Ukraine, when Russia has always been very clear that's never been their objective. In fact, I remember reading some stories where President Putin told Zelensky, look, we can stop this right here in the Donbass. We can, if we can just settle that issue, we're done. We can all go on with our day. And so, but you keep hearing people like Rubio and others keep talking about, oh, Russia wants to take all of Ukraine. We have to stop Russia from. So when you continue to make inflammatory misstatements like that, what does that do to the dialogue? Or are people like Rubio just trying to set up this straw man so that they can claim victory, having achieved something that the adversary never intended to do in the first place?
I mean, that may be what's going on. I personally can't speak to, what the strategy is of Rubio and company saying that. I don't give Marco Rubio credit at this point in time, because he doesn't deserve credit for having a strategy on this. He, like Donald Trump, is a prisoner of the analysis done by Keith Kellogg, the former Lieutenant General, U.S. Army Lieutenant General, who is, now advising Donald Trump. He's his envoy. And Keith Kellogg wrote a paper that was published last April or May. And I've been reading this paper and over again. And, I read a lot of analysis of Ukraine that is just, it's infantile in its in its analytical approach. And this paper falls into that category. Fact, errors, assertions of things that never happened, exaggeration of capabilities, minimizing losses, the whole thing, drawing conclusions that are just so unrealistic. And yet it's this paper that serves as the foundation of the 100-day peace plan that's been promulgated and put out there. The Wall Street Journal's reported on it, and et cetera. Totally unrealistic. And I think Marco Rubio continues to be a prisoner of that. But here's the danger in getting involved in a discussion of things that have no relevance, is that you miss what's really happening. Right now, the Russians are in back channel talks with Romanians, Hungarians, Slovakians, and the Poles about the future of Western Ukraine. Because Russia knows when this war ends that, it will probably be limited to, in terms of territory, Crimea and the 4 constitutionally protected territories of Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Lugansk. That Russia will not be occupying Odessa, Kharkov, Dnipropetrovsk, or Mykolaiv. Now, if the war continues, then Russia may in fact do that, but Russia has no designs on those right now. I think the Russian intent there is to constitutionally create protections for the Russian-speaking population, and then in a period of time, maybe 3 years or 5 years, to hold referendum offering the Russian-speaking population the option of seceding from Ukraine and joining Russia. That seems to be some thought process into that. But when the war ends, those territories will be part of Ukraine. But the Russians want to denazify Ukraine. In order to do that, you have to, disenfranchise the hotbed of Banderist ideology. Stepan Bandera, the Ukrainian ultranationalist who, fought alongside Nazi Germany in World War II. His troops are responsible for some of the greatest war crimes during that period of time. They were the guards in the German concentration camps. The Banderists carried out the Volyn massacre in 1943-44, killing 110,000-120,000 Poles. In the post-war conflict, the Banderists resisted up until 1954, killing another 230,000 Russians and Ukrainians. And these people now are empowered in Zelensky's government, the Banderas, the Azov regiment, the Kraken unit, all these militarized fascist units. The Ukrainian airborne forces sing songs on their graduation glorifying Stepan Bandera as the father of Ukraine. He is a national hero of Ukraine. The Russians say that can't be part of Ukraine. And so they're going to denazify. But what do you do with Western Ukraine? And I think one of the things that's being bandied about is give it back to the Poles, because the Poles aren't going to sit there and say, Stepan Bandera, the guy who killed 110,000 of us in Volyn, which now is going to become part of our, the Poles won't allow that. The Poles will cleanse that. It'll become a Polish problem. The Hungarian population in the Carpathian region will become part of Hungary. The Slovakian part, Ruthenians, part of Slovakia. They're going to carve it up. And if Rubio is sitting there playing stupid games about talking about the Russians advancing, he's missing the real dialogue that's happening. And he should be concerned about that, because if we get in the business of starting to redraw the map of Europe, I'll tell you right now, there's a lot of controversy going on between Germany and Poland about Silesia and the former East Prussia territories that were ceded to Poland to offset the territories that were absorbed by the Soviet Union, which today constitute Western Ukraine. Redrawing maps gets to be a dangerous game that Europe had thought they were done doing. So the United States, I think, should be involved in monitoring that and intervening to say, no. Redrawing maps isn't going to happen. That's not what's going to happen. We need a different solution. But we're not focused on that's the real problem. We're focused on the fake problem of the Russians advancing all the way to the Ukrainian-Polish border, which Russia's not doing.
Well, to your point about Rubio playing silly games, when you play silly games, you win silly prizes. And Marco Rubio is not a diplomat. Marco Rubio is not a historian. Little Marco doesn't know what he's doing. So in a normal administration, and Joe Biden was victim of this as well. He had it was the Peter principle. People had been promoted to their levels of incompetence. So Marco Rubio, in terms of Secretary of State, is incompetent. Yeah. He can't sit in the room with Wang Yi. He can't sit in a room with Lavrov and go toe to toe, thought for thought. He doesn't have that mental horsepower. So you're saying that the United States is focused on the wrong thing. It's because it has the wrong people with no focus in jobs they have no business being in.
Yep. 100%. I mean, especially Rubio. We know what Rubio was. Rubio was the $100 billion, baby purchased by Adelson's widow. Rubio was supposed to be the vice presidential pick. Trump said, no, I'm not bringing in somebody who has repeatedly stabbed me in the back. Realize that Marco Rubio is not a friend of Donald Trump. Marco Rubio is a harsh critic of Donald Trump, somebody who thought he could do a better job of being president than Donald Trump. That's the last person Trump wants in his administration, is somebody who says, I can be a better president than Donald Trump. So why is Marco Rubio Secretary of State? $100 million is why. Trump took the money, and that's the price. So Rubio's coming, but even Rubio's smart enough to understand that he's bought and paid for. He said it. He said in his confirmation hearing and statements afterwards that he is going to faithfully execute the policies of the president of the United States. That means no independent thinking, no Marco Rubio pass it. What he said in the past stays in the past. Today he's totally focused on what the president, and then he said, and there will be many issues where I'm just not going to be involved, meaning that Donald Trump's, flagship programs like peace in Ukraine, that's a Trump baby. You think he's going to let Rubio carry the water on China? That's a Trump baby. Trump's going to get the big ticket items. North Korea, he's going to go back and be best buddies with Kim Jong-un. Rubio is not going to be part of that. So the flagship foreign policy moves that the United States can make, I think closing the deal with Iran, if it gets to that point, That's Trump's thing. He's the one that says, I can make a better deal with Iran, not Marco Rubio. So Rubio is going to be left, have you ever seen that movie, Dave? With Kevin Kline. You remember at the beginning that they send the vice president off to Africa just to get him the hell out of the office, and he comes back with the shield and the spear. I am here. I've come back from Bantu land, and I am and it's like, that's going to be Marco Rubio. While the president's doing the real work of diplomacy, Marco Rubio is going to be going off, holding hands in South America, holding hands in Africa, holding hands in Europe. But the president's going to be taking the lead on the big things. And that's the reality, because Rubio isn't qualified to be Secretary of State. Rubio is just somebody who was bought and paid for $100 million. He'll do 2 years and then he'll leave.
Final point on all of this, the stories about North Koreans fighting on behalf of Russia and dying on the Ukrainian front. Everything I've read says, no, they're not North Koreans, that people need to understand that Russia is the country with the largest landmass in the world. There are over 100 ethnicities that fall under the Russian umbrella. What is it? Over 100? Is it 100 time zones? Different time zones? How many?
Not 100. No. It's like
what? I don't
14, 15, something like that.
So,
it's a lot of time zones. Yeah.
So that the so-called North Koreans that were captured were actually from Tuva, which is in Mongolia, and that not all Asians look alike, and so in fact the original report was the North Koreans that were captured had ID cards saying they were from Tuva. Well, why don't we use Occam's razor and say, well, the simplest answer is probably the best answer. If the guy's ID says he's from Tuva, let's start there. Scott Ritter.
Yeah, there's a couple things here. First of all, understand that in Russia, there is a significant population of North Koreans who are Russian citizens of the Russian Federation. This is a legacy that goes back to Stalin's times, in the close cooperation with North Korea. The Russians, occupied, the Korean Peninsula in the aftermath of the war, and then withdrew, taking Koreans with them. There were North Koreans who were laborers in Japanese camp. The bottom line is there's a whole bunch of North Koreans in the Soviet Union. And when the Soviet Union fell, many of them ended up being in Russia, and they were Russian citizens. And so it's possible that you can have a North Korean or a Korean, in the Russian military. But my wife grew up in Georgia, Republic of Georgia, Soviet Republic. One of her best friends from childhood, went to school together, is a Korean. Now, he doesn't speak Korean. He doesn't know anything about Korea, except what his family's taught him. He was raised as a Georgian, a citizen of Georgia, then a Soviet citizen, then a citizen of Russia, went to Moscow State University, etc. But he's a Korean. There's lots of those people, but there's also different, again, the ignorance of the West, because it's not just the Tuvan Republic. There are they're Buryats. You go up to a little bit north of Mongolia. You've got the Buryats, who are also Asiatics. There are entire military units recruited from that area who have almost complete membership being Buryats. Now, if you look at the Buryats running around and you're ignorant about what a North Korean looks like, you go, oh, look, there's North Koreans and all this stuff. So there's that element going on too. There is a strategic relationship with Russia and North Korea that allows for this kind of interaction, but it's not the North Koreans taking entire units and taking them and plugging them into Russia without. There's a step that has to occur before that. And that's where you attach liaison officers at the Army staff, at the Corps staff, at the division staff, at the brigade staff, at the battalion staff, doing fire support coordination. They may have brought some artillery units in and incorporated them to teach them how to do Russian call for fire coordination, how to do, coordination with close air support, all the techniques that if in the future Russians and Ukrainians or Koreans are going to be fighting side by side, these are the things that have to happen to take these lessons back to Korea and train their soldiers so that if in some time in the future North Korean units were to come in, they'd be able to plug in, just like it happened in the old days in NATO back in the 1980s. Back then you could take a German battalion and plug it into an American brigade and it would function because they had the same equipment, the same training, the same vocabulary. They knew what they were talking about. Mm-hmm. That has to happen first. The idea that Russia's absorbing in complete North Korean units and saying, here's your sector in the battlefield, go, is absurd in the extreme. First of all, when those reports started coming out, there wasn't a strategic relationship between Russia and North Korea. And remember what we talked about, Putin being a lawyer and right. all the thing. Could you imagine a scenario where the Russians, who are, they don't do anything unless the paperwork allows them to do it. The Russians mm-hmm. don't take that kind of initiative. And suddenly they're going, well, we haven't signed a strategic agreement that's been ratified by either North Koreans, Parliament or the Russian Duma. But what the hell? Let's just put them on trains and send them in anyways with no status of force agreement, nothing, no legal framework. We're just going to let them go. It will never happen. For a North Korean soldier to be on the soil of Russia, there has to be an agreement. There has to be a plan that has to be linked and all that stuff. And I believe that agreement does exist. It allows for certain things to have happened at the command level in terms of liaison, maybe some fire support units, maybe some minor special forces units going out there and working in conjunction with their Russian special forces unit. But the idea that North Korea sent in a regiment that's doing a human wave attack, no, it's absurd. It's ridiculous.
Tom asks, even if there are North Koreans there, so what? And the answer from me on that one is, you're right. It does in the great scheme of things, it doesn't matter. But I believe that misinformation and disinformation was being used as evidence to demonstrate the desperation of Russia. They were trying to support a narrative that Russia now is being defeated. They're losing so many of their own that they've now had to turn to North Korea for support. Scott Ritter.
Well, I also think it was about the same narrative that Russia was internationalizing this fight. And if mm-hmm. the Russians can bring in the North Koreans, then by God, the Ukrainians can bring in NATO countries. Well, I mean, you sort of already have. I mean,
right. I was going to say
and all that. But it's but the Russians, I think, have been very careful. Notice that these North Korean liaison elements are only operating on the soil of old Russia. That Russia has been very careful. You won't find any North Korean advisors attached to the forces operating in Novorossiya, in Kherson, in Zaporizhia, in Donetsk and Lugansk. You won't find them there, because if they were there, then the case could be made that Russia has interjected an international element into that fight, and it could create a legitimate argument for NATO to intervene. Russia said, no, what the fighting is taking place is on Russian soil, old Russian soil, because of a NATO invasion of Russia. And you don't have any say on what we do on this territory, none whatsoever. So there's a lot of games being played with the North Koreans right now, but the bottom line is, none of it's true. It's just an act of desperation. It's part of the psychological warfare. It'll be an interesting effort once this war ends to go back and unwind all the propaganda and reassess the situation based upon reality. It's like what happened in Vietnam. When we first finished the Vietnam War, there was a certain history that was being told, and then as years passed, more archives were opened up, interviews were based, and we were able to reimagine that. Then years later, more information came out, reimagined. And if you take a look at our understanding of the Vietnam War today and compare and contrast it with what we were being told at the time, it's two totally different wars. It's as if, and I think you're going to see that's the case with Ukraine, that a whole bunch of stuff that the West has been spoon-fed by a compliant media based on the lies promulgated by NATO, the United States, and the European Union, and the Ukrainians themselves. There's nothing real taking place in this narrative today. You see that with the BBC, and suddenly the BBC is starting to realize that this war is about to end. We might want to start telling the truth, and this is a completely different approach to analysis, which is starting to reflect reality, something the BBC was incapable of doing a year ago.
When you say now, I know your time is short. You got a few more minutes?
Sure.
Okay. So when you said the war is about to end, and I hope you don't think this is a stupid question. What does that mean? And what I mean by that is, how do we get there from here? Because I can only see one option, and that's surrender.
Yeah, I mean, the war is an extension of politics by other means. I keep using that statement, and I know that the people, the students of Clausewitz are like, shut up with that already, Ritter. But it's true. You can't just view war in terms of battalions maneuvering on a battlefield. Every war is linked to political objectives, etc. The shooting war is about to end. It's going to end one way or another. It's either going to end with the total collapse and physical destruction of the Ukrainian army, or through negotiation that preserves that Ukrainian army only to be dismantled as part of the terms that Russia's going to set forth, which says there won't be a Ukrainian army. When they talk about demilitarization, that's what they mean. But this is going to happen. Now, the question is on the timeline, will the United States... I warned you about the FedEx truck.
I understand.
Will the United States be able to get the settlement, agree to what the Russians want? Donald Trump gets one shot. Everybody keeps asking, why hasn't he made that phone call yet? Because he realizes that he can't make that phone call right now because he doesn't have his act together. That if he goes forward with the Russians, with the absurdity that Keith Kellogg's giving him, the Russians will just dismiss him. He has to be better prepared. And so they're delaying this phone call. They're delaying that until they get a better grasp of what the reality is. And I think the reality is going to be along the lines of the Russian reality, not the Marco Rubio reality, not the Keith Kellogg reality, but the Russian reality. And if the United States can do that, then there is a peace deal to be had. But if the United States insists on the impossible, Russia will just dismiss them and continue going forward with this meat grinder until they physically destroy the Ukrainian army.
And Cherie asked, did they finally arrest the South Korean president for treason? Yes, they did. He was arrested like in the middle of January. Yeah. After he was impeached, he was arrested. I don't know if he's still in jail, but he was arrested.
Oh, he's on trial right now. I think the trial is actually going forward right now.
Okay. So I just want to, Cherie, want to be sure that we keep you abreast of the latest developments in world events. Quickly, Scott, there's reporting that Trump plans to withdraw thousands of troops from Syria. He's planning to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria. This was reported in Turkey. The senior White House officials conveyed a message to their Israeli counterparts indicating that Trump intends to pull thousands of troops from Syria. And we know that Netanyahu is supposed to, I think the first state visit to the White House is going to be Netanyahu very, very soon. U.S. pulling out of Syria, your thoughts on how practical that is, and that could then cause great problems for Israel, could it not?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not a big fan of the U.S. military presence in Syria. I find it to be unlawful. And indeed, we are, by stealing the oil of Syria, taking it out of the ground and giving it to Kurds and allowing them to market it to make money, we're committing war crimes, literal war crimes. So I'm a big fan of, getting the United States out of there. But we do have to acknowledge that the world has changed with the collapse of Bashar al-Assad, and now you have Turkey, muscling in with the Kurds. we need to leave, but I don't think I don't think it should be precipitous, meaning that we should leverage the fact that many people want our troops to leave, and therefore, as part of the negotiation, we get certain things put in place that engender stability in the region, like preventing the Turks from running in and rolling over the Kurds, and and creating an instability that could, create a vacuum that allows HTS, these Al-Qaeda operatives, now to move into northern Iraq and seize Mosul, which is something the Turks want. I think our troops right now provide an effective check against Turkish expansion. And if we withdraw these troops precipitously, because this, if we leave Syria, we're leaving northern Iraq. And if we leave northern Iraq, the Turks are coming into northern Iraq. And, this is the reality. So if I were advising the president, I would say, I know you want to leave Syria, but Mr. President, what I would actually advise is that we reinforce our Syrian position, and we tell the Turks we're not leaving until we get certain guarantees in place. Mm-hmm. But I don't see Trump being that strategic. I think he said, I said I'm getting the troops out. I'm going to get the troops out. And I think there's going to be a huge power vacuum in that region that Turkey will exploit to its advantage.
Another power vacuum. And that is one of the largest dangers that I think we've seen from American action. I'll just say since Vietnam. You might pick another point in time, but we create these circumstances where we topple governments, we intervene, we create these power vacuums, and we know that nature deplores a vacuum.
Look at getting rid of Saddam Hussein.
Right.
Getting rid of Saddam Hussein created a huge power vacuum that forever changed the dynamic of the Middle East and directly led to many of the conflicts that we see today. So,
getting rid of Gaddafi.
Getting rid of Gaddafi. Look at Libya and the disaster that is. So we're very good at power vacuums. I had an interesting discussion with Chas Freeman, Ambassador Chas Freeman, former ambassador to Saudi Arabia, et cetera, a very experienced diplomat. And he said that America is very good at starting wars, but we're not very good at ending wars. And we always create more problems, getting out of the conflict than the problems we're trying to solve by getting into the conflict. So we are the problem, not the solution. And that's the reality.
Scott Ritter, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, as always, appreciate that analysis, and look forward to having you back.
Thank you very much. And I look forward to the weather getting better, and we can
play some golf.
Go hit that little white ball. Okay.
Thanks, Scott. Folks, thank you all so much for listening to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Wilmer Leon. Stay tuned. New episodes every day. Please follow and subscribe, leave a review, share the show. You can follow us on social media. We need you to hit that like button, trying to get to 10,000 and trying to get there quickly. You can find all the links below in the show description. Please reach out to your friends. Ask them to check this out. Ask them to hit the like button. We need some help in that regard. Remember that this is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge, because talk without analysis is just chatter, and we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. See y'all tomorrow. Until then, I am Wilmer Leon. Have a wonderful, blessed day. Peace. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.